Today, David Leeming is an English professor at the University of Connecticut. Back in the 1960s, when he was in graduate school, he was James Baldwin's personal assistant. And later he continued to be close friends with Baldwin for more than 2 decades until Baldwin's death. His acclaimed biography of Baldwin, published in 2015, opens with a quote from the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, chapter 2, verse 5. And they, whether they will hear, and whether they will forbear, yet they will know there hath been a prophet among them. That epigraph is appropriate for a number of reasons. For one, it's from the King James Bible, and as the African-American writer Darrell Pickney said of Baldwin, no other black writer I'd read was as literary as Baldwin in his early essays, not even Ralph Ellison. There's something wild in the beauty of Baldwin's sentences and in the cool of his tone. Something improbable, too, in this meeting of Henry James, the King James Bible, and Harlem. A second reason that an epigram from Ezekiel is appropriate is that James Baldwin was also a prophet in the terms of our UU second source. The words and deeds of prophetic people who challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, with compassion, with love. Baldwin was a powerful prophetic voice, but that also meant that, like many prophetic people before him, he wasn't always easy to live with. In Leeming's words, almost from the moment that I met Baldwin, I recognized that I was in the presence of a highly complex, troubled, and driven individual who was more intensely serious than anyone I had ever met. This is not to say that he didn't enjoy life. He laughed a lot. He knew how to make others laugh. And while clearly obsessed by what he saw as his witnessing role, witnessing and reflecting back to this society what it was, he was just as committed to a life of the senses. When he ate a meal, smoked a cigarette, sipped on a scotch, touched another human being, he did so with deep pleasure and with an almost incomparable elegance and care. He was a man like most people with evident neuroses. He was not a saint, but he was a prophet. And I'll do my best to do justice to at least part of his prophetic life. However, in the spirit of full disclosure, any of you that have ever seen even a brief video clip of Baldwin speaking, know that words could never fully capture the nature of his prophetic and charismatic presence. And if this sermon leaves you interested in learning more, there's at least 2 great documentaries about Baldwin's life. The first is James Baldwin, The Price of a Ticket. It premiered on PBS in 1990, just a few years after his death. The only place I could find it streaming was through Amazon, the Sundance Channel subscription, which you can get a free week of, which I did, and then unsubscribed. Pro tip. The second is called I Am Not Your Negro, and makes many connections between Baldwin's life as well as current events in our country today. I highly recommend both of them. And I'm grateful that new work continues to be made about James Baldwin's life and work, because when he died in 1987 from cancer, he was only 63 years old. As a point of reference, he was born only 7 years before Toni Morrison, who's very much still with us. And it was Morrison's review of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, that compelled me both to read Coates closely and to go back and read more of Baldwin. In Morrison's words, I've been wondering who might fill the intellectual void that has plagued me since James Baldwin's death. Clearly, it is Ta-Nehisi Coates. Morrison, of course, is far from the only person to find James Baldwin's writing as relevant as ever. Even though he died 2.5 decades before the Black Lives Matter movement, Baldwin was always ahead of his time. Long before activists started emphasizing the importance of intersectionality, that first part of that word, intersection, being attentive to the ways that systemic oppressions like race and class and gender intersect or compound the oppression. Long before that, Baldwin was writing boldly out of his embodied experience of growing up at the intersection of being black, poor, and gay. Regarding what it meant in Baldwin's lifetime to be black, poor, and gay, keep in mind that Baldwin was born in 1924. By the time the civil rights movement started in 1954, he had already lived the first 3 decades of his life. Indeed, in 1948, disillusioned with all of the injustices that he saw and hear his native country, he moved to Paris at the age of 24. And because I want to give you a few points, a taste of Baldwin's inimitable writing style, here's just one sentence about his early days in the City of Light. He said, "Paris is, according to the legend, the city where everyone loses his head and his morals. Lives through at least one histoire d'amour," that means a love story. Baldwin did become fluent in French. "Ceases quite to arrive anywhere on time, and thumbs his nose at the Puritans. The city, in brief, were all become drunken on the fine old air of freedom." And perhaps living in Paris was part of what gave him the courage to publish Giovanni's Room, a play with strong themes of both homosexuality and bisexuality. He published that in 1956, a full decade and a half before the Stonewall uprisings launched the civil rights movement for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender civil rights. And while Giovanni's Room is a landmark text of LGBT literature, it also is much more than a merely historic text. In a similar way that James Baldwin's letter to my 14-year-old nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the same way that it was published in his 1963 book, The Fire Next Time, the same way that inspired Ta-Nehisi Coates to write a similar letter to his 14-year-old nephew in the forum of Between the World and Me, Giovanni's Room directly inspired Barry Jenkins to create the film Moonlight. How many of you saw that picture? Okay, quite a few. I would recommend you to see that as well if you have a chance. It won last year's Oscar for Best Picture. It actually deserved the Oscar, unlike most pictures that win the Oscar. That's a separate sermon. In the words of one reviewer, Moonlight is not simply about characters, alienated gay black men who resemble Baldwin's heroes. It also has some of the writer's sensibilities. The film, like much of Baldwin's work, feels as European as it does American. Its dark, oblique lyricism seems to come straight out of Michelangelo Antonioni or Ingmar Bergman. In describing Baldwin's popularity today, I should also be clear that he was, unlike some artists, actually quite popular and best-selling in his own time. In May 1963, for example, he was on the cover of Time magazine, and just a few days later, he was invited to meet with Bobby Kennedy. At this time, RFK was still U.S. Attorney General, and his brother's assassination would not happen for a few months that November. In looking back on that meeting, the differences in perspective between Baldwin and Bobby Kennedy are both striking and hauntingly parallel to our own time. Baldwin and his fellow racial justice activists entered the meeting hoping that President Kennedy would agree to personally escort a child in the Deep South to school. They thought this would be a powerful act of solidarity, and that anyone who dared spit on that child would be spitting on the nation, because the president had walked in solidarity with him or her. But Bobby Kennedy dismissed this suggestion as that would just be a meaningless moral gesture. From the opposite view, Bobby Kennedy was shocked as their conversation continued when one of the activists in the room, who had been a freedom rider helping integrate the public bus systems, told Kennedy that, to be honest with you, the failure of the federal government to protect me and other activists from racist violence in the South means that I just couldn't even imagine fighting for this country in the armed forces. Kennedy responded that seemed deeply unpatriotic to him. Baldwin and the other activists were equally surprised at Kennedy's failure to understand how their experience of racial injustice had made them feel alienated from their native land. There are strong parallels between these two different sets of experiences in many things, but in particular, the conflict that we've seen played out between people's differing perceptions of NFL player Colin Kaepernick being unpatriotic, or is he being serving justice by kneeling during the national anthem. Returning to that historical debate, Kennedy responded that, well, my Irish descendants also faced oppression in America, but we pulled ourselves up. He added that with luck, he literally said this, with luck, a black man could be president in 40 years. Baldwin didn't take that well. For what it's worth, though, that prediction was fairly prescient. Barack Obama, who was not quite 2 years old at the time that Baldwin and RFK were speaking, was elected President of the United States 45 years later. So Bobby Kennedy was off by 5 years. But it's also important to consider the ways in which the reluctance of Kennedy and other white leaders to fully be in solidarity with the struggle for racial justice contributed to that delay in more equality being reached. It's sort of like, you're helping create your prediction. You're putting your thumb on the scale. Along those lines, Baldwin retorted that Kennedy was partially right, but most Irish people had immigrated to the U.S. much later than most African Americans who had not immigrated, but been forcibly enslaved and brought over, and an Irish American was already president, while in Baldwin's words, blacks are, quote, still required to supplicate and beg for your justice. That's the prophetic part. He said that right to RFK's face. There's one similar episode 2 years later that I also wanted to be sure to share. Baldwin's 1965 debate at Cambridge University with the major conservative intellectual William F. Buckley. Baldwin's assignment was to argue in support of the notion that the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. And he was like, sure, I'll do that. In Leaming's words, Baldwin had always been a successful extemporaneous speaker. He learned his skills in the Pentecostal pulpit. But this is one of his greatest speeches, and all of Buckley's famous wit and reasoning prowess had little effect. After comparing himself to the prophet Jeremiah in this case, Baldwin proceeded in the allotted time to outline with admirable dexterity what it was like growing up black in America. To realize, in his words, as a child, that the land to which you have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to you. To come to that shocking realization. To be shocked to discover that you've been rooting for Gary Cooper your whole life in Westerns as he killed the Indians, only to wake up one day and realize that the Indians are you. He said, my ancestors picked the cotton under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. Most uncharacteristically, the Cambridge students gave him a standing ovation, and Baldwin's position won 544 votes to Buckley's 184. Thankfully, that debate was videotaped. You can watch it. It's great. There are incredible clips from that debate in both of the documentaries that I mentioned. But of course, Baldwin was not interested in more rhetorical flourish. He didn't just want to win debates. He wanted justice. He wanted liberty. He wanted equal protection under the law. As to how that might be accomplished, I'll invite you to consider two more brief excerpts of his writing. The first is the famous final paragraph from that searing long-form essay that first appeared in the New Yorker and was unlike anything the New Yorker had published prior to that. It was that open letter to his nephew that was later published as The Fire Next Time. It goes like this. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others. If we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. And if we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is among us, that God gave Noah the rainbow sign, but no more water, the fire next time. as to whether we were more likely to achieve the founding values of our country, that all people are created equal, or whether we were more likely to end up with apocalyptic violence, the fire next time. Baldwin had periods of serious depression in his life, wrestling with that, in which he did sometimes lose hope. But he also famously said, in his inimitable way, at that intersection of Henry James, the King James Bible, and Harlem, that we actually have no other choice but to continue in the struggle for justice, because in his words, despair is a sin. He added, and there are people who have proved to me that we can be better than we are. That's one reason we continue to gather in places like this sanctuary. We need each other. We need to be reminded of what is possible together. In that spirit, Baldwin wrote these words in his 1964 book, Nothing Personal. He said, "For nothing is fixed forever and forever and forever. It's not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them, for we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises, the light fails. Lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. And the moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us, and the light goes out." And even though Baldwin is no longer with us, his work continues to call on us to act for peace and justice within our spheres of influence, whatever they are, to act for peace and justice, to lean into creativity and hope. His funeral was held in New York City's Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the same church which more than a decade earlier, where he had been given an award as a prophet of the 20th century. Toni Morrison's eulogy, later published in the New York Times, began with these words: "Jimmy, there's too much to think about you, too much to feel. The difficulty is that your life refuses summation. It always did. It invites us to contemplation instead. I never heard a single command from you. Yet the demands that you made on me, the challenges that you issued me, are nevertheless unmistakable, even if unenforced. That I work and think at the top of my form. That I stand on moral ground, but know that the ground must be shored up by mercy. And that the world is before me, and I need not take it or leave it as it was when I came." Morrison concluded, you knew, didn't you, how I needed your language and the mind that formed it. How I relied on your fierce courage to tame the wildernesses for me. How strengthened I was by the certainty that came from knowing that you would never hurt me. You knew, didn't you, how I loved your love. You knew. This then is no calamity. No, this is Jubilee. Our crown, you said, had already been bought and paid for. All we have to do is wear it. And we do, Jimmy. You crowned us. As we continue to reflect on the legacy of James Baldwin's prophetic life and work, I invite you to turn in your hymnals to 407. This spiritual powerfully represents the radical inclusion at the intersection of race, class, sexuality, gender, and other oppressions that Baldwin embodied and lived. The Welcome Table is the title of the unfinished play that preoccupied Baldwin's mind right up until the end of his life. This final unpublished play was about the legendary performer Josephine Baker's home and her practice of adopting young people of all backgrounds, all cultures, and all ethnicities into her family to welcome them into her home at her kitchen table. In that spirit, let's sing together the welcome table. Nick will play through it once. Let's rise and body your spirit.